I'm Tim Constantine, host of America's The Capitol Hill Show and a writer for the Washington Times. Thank you for joining us. Today we'll have a discussion on the relationship between the United States and Iran, what its policies have been, and perhaps where they should be in the future. We put together a great panel for you. From the United States, Michael Mukasey was the 81st Attorney General of the United States. Linda Chavez ran the Public Liaison Office of the White House during the Reagan administration. And Ambassador Blackwell served as ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. Thank you all for being here. Let's start the discussion with the election process. As you all know, the president of Iran was killed several weeks ago, and there is a process in Iran to replace the president. There are some clear rules. For example, no woman is allowed to run for president. All candidates are vetted by the Guardian Council. There were 6 that were approved. Of those, 2 have already withdrawn. General Mukasey, let's start with you. Talk about the process and how this impacts the people of Iran.
Well, this assures that the people of Iran will have little or no voice in the selection of the candidates. It also assures that they will have fidelity to Khamenei, and who is, of course, runs the Guardian Council, which selects the candidates. This is a process that's been ongoing one way or another in Iran for decades, and it has been going on to decreasing popularity. And I suspect that this election isn't going to do anything to raise the popularity either of the process or of the people participating in it.
Ms. Chavez, the question here is women aren't allowed to participate in the process. It's a foreign concept in the West. How important is it that half of the population is eliminated from even being a candidate?
Well, I mean, that is nothing new for this regime. Women are not even second-class citizens. They're not always even treated with full human rights, much less civil rights. So it's not terribly surprising. What is very interesting about this election is that the 4 remaining members, I think all of them, have ties of one sort or another to the IRGC. And one of them was a participant in the massacre that occurred in 1988. So these are hardly candidates from which the population, women or men, can freely choose someone to represent their aspirations or their interest in policy. It's a sham.
During the primary process, they have an election process there. There were parliamentary elections in March and then another run in May. The participation in that was very low. There was 20% voter participation in March, 7% in May. Ambassador, what does that say about the public's confidence in their process when only 7% even take the time or effort to go and vote?
I think it's a full recognition that this is a process that is designed to control the electoral turnout. And when you deny people a voice through their vote, folks know that what is produced is a sham. Look, at the end of the day, your voice is a vote, and your vote is your voice. And so we see women being denied the opportunity to speak, and we see a disincentive for a broad number of folks to produce a representative government. This is an autocracy, and one of the things we've known since Aristotle is that there's a dynamic tension between individual freedom and the centralized power of a government. In a highly centralized government, what happens is that they pick the individuals who they want to speak, and that's why this is a fight for individual freedom, and we can no longer have the international community go silent on us.
Let's talk a little bit about the individuals, the 4 men who are on the ballot. Mustafa Pourmohammadi was part of the Death Commission, 1988 massacres. Again, what message does it send the public when you have a history like that and you now have been vetted by the six clergy as qualified and recommended to potentially be president of the nation?
Well, in a way, he would be a fit successor to Raisi, who, it will be recalled, was also an active participant in the death commissions. And his candidacy specifically shows that this regime hasn't changed and won't change.
Saeed Jalili was part of the nuclear negotiation team. Agree or disagree with the policies of the Obama administration, there was open discussion, at least between the United States and Iran during that time period. As a candidate, is that a good thing, a potentially good thing in relative terms to the West if he was chosen?
Well, it is going to be very interesting to see how the West reacts. And obviously, the Biden administration was not in favor of pulling out, President Biden having been vice president during the Obama years. But one of the things that I worry about is, for example, if he were to be chosen, that the West would react by saying, oh, well, this is a moderating influence. That was exactly the way they reacted to Raisi. And I remember all of the news stories, front pages of the New York Times, Washington Post, and others, acting as if Raisi was somehow going to be a moderate voice in Iran. And, oh, gee, we're now going to be able to do business with Iran. Of course, it turned out not to be true. It will be very interesting to see if we see a similar kind of response should the gentleman be elected.
Mohammad Ghalibaf is the Speaker of Parliament now. When we look at Parliament in Iran as it currently operates, what does that tell us about this candidate?
Look, it's a closed system. This guy is part of the problem. He has a history that should be alarming to anybody who is in favor of an open democratic process. And so this selection among these candidates suggests that there's a fix to maintain the status quo when it comes down to the reins of power in Iran. This is a designed system to produce more of the same.
Masoud Pezeshkian is described by some in the Western media as the moderate. But when asked what he believes the role of president is, he says it is simply to carry out the wishes of the supreme leader. Is that moderate?
Well, I think it's at least honest. That is exactly right. I mean, this is a whole sham process. This is not a free election. Yes, people have choices, but they are very much constricted, not just by sex, but also, obviously, when you have the clerics being the ones to decide who gets to run. And there really isn't any difference between any of these candidates. They all will do the will of Khamenei and whoever is Khamenei's successor, because he's getting up there in years. Any attempt to look at this and say that there is any hope for moderation in Iran, there's only one hope for moderation in Iran, and that's regime change.
General.
The last candidate, a law school classmate of mine, wrote a post that I read just before I left, suggesting that somehow one source of hope for that candidate might be that he's a physician. I pointed out to him that Ayman al-Zawahiri, the successor of Osama bin Laden, was a physician, and come to think of it, Dr. Mengele was a physician too.
And Mr. Assad.
And Mr. Assad. Dr. Assad is a physician.
Right.
So the notion that somehow a physician is going to be a moderating force, I think is illusory.
In the United States, the parties will argue amongst themselves. Democrats will argue amongst themselves. Republicans will argue amongst themselves. For example, the conservatives in the Republican Party will complain about moderates, Republican in name only. And yet the actual difference on issues, when you look at the big picture, isn't that great. They may be important on certain issues, but in the big picture, isn't that great. When we talk about moderate in Iran, and we talk about the big picture, how moderate is moderate?
In the spirit of Ronald Reagan, this is a debate between pastels. This is not a debate between painting in bold colors of freedom and pastels. By design, we have to understand that oppression, repression in Iran is systemic. It is a system, and changing personalities on the board is not what is in order. Changing the system, and that will only be done when you have people with their vote and their voice being able to freely speak into the system.
Let's talk about policy, the United States policy toward Iran. And if you are in my age bracket, then you grew up about the time of the Islamic regime coming to power. And so that's all most people my age or younger have ever known. When we look at the policy over the last 4 presidents, you look at President Bush policy, President Obama policy, President Trump policy, President Biden policy. There have been wide variations in how they approach Iran. How can the NCRI or MEK or those who would like to see regime change count on the United States to support their efforts when each administration seems to change every 4 or 8 years?
That's an excellent and a very vexing question, because the variation that you point out goes from believing that you can engage with these people, that they can be brought into the world community, that you can reach a common understanding, to harsh recognition that unremitting pressure is the only thing that's going to change them. I think what that shows is that the Iranian people are going to have to look to themselves for regime change and really make it apparent that it is going to come from within. And that will, in a way, reform the United States as well.
The Reagan administration was crystal clear. It was a different era, but it was in the immediate aftermath. They were crystal clear in their opposition to the current regime in its early years. How has that changed over the years?
Well, I think there's always a kind of naive hope among Americans that other people are like us, and of course they want the same things we do. Well, I think the people of Iran do want the same things we do, but they have no opportunity to be able to exercise those aspirations. And I think that gets us into a whole lot of problems. I think the regime tells us who they are. They are not secret about this. And it isn't just that they control all aspects of government. It isn't just that there's no separation between church and state, or mosque and state, I guess, in that circumstance. There is an intrusion into daily lives. There is how you live your life. If you're a woman, you have to dress a certain way, and you can't even have a strand of hair fall out outside the veil in public. You have no rights as a mother. If there's a divorce, you lose your rights. Your word is not taken in a trial. So those aspects, I think, in terms of the day-to-day lives of ordinary Iranians, are one of the things that they're rebelling against. And what I would hope is that at least the U.S. government and all Western governments not do anything to interfere with groups like the NCRI and the MEK. They don't have to actively support, and I think when it comes to U.S. support, that can be problematic. But you don't want the government doing things as they did back in the days when the MEK was on the terror list, that actively interfered with the aspirations of the Iranian people. And thanks to Judge Mukasey and others, that is no longer the case.
You said the words, show us who they are. They've showed us who they are. And I go back to the Obama administration. And when they negotiated the nuclear agreement, literally the day that the administration signed that agreement, the supreme leader was leading chants of death to America, death to America. The two things seemed very incongruent. Do American administrations ignore what is right in front of them?
Well, some do. Let me just put it this way. Iran is part, and I'm going to get to why I think it's in our interest to be active in making sure that people are given the opportunity to change the regime. Look at who Iran is aligned with now. You have them aligned with China. You have them aligned with Putin's Russia. Look at what that triumvirate is trying to do to change our dollar from the reserve currency. They're trying to weaken us in terms of oil. And as a consequence, any administration that frees up any dollars that have been taken from Iran, that strengthens them to re-engage in their nuclear weapon development, is going down the wrong path. So yes, we need to look at our self-interest as Americans and make sure that we're voting that way in international communities and as we organize our domestic constituencies to see why we, in fact, should be very much helping to create a context where people in Iran are free to actually change the regime.
In any political issue, whether domestic or foreign policy, the pendulum tends to swing and go to one extreme. And when it's gone a little too far, the American public speaks up and it starts to come back. There was a time where America meddled perhaps too much in certain places, tried to control things too much in certain places on the globe, and it came back from that. Have we gone too far in the other direction? I think of the president of Iran being killed this year. Was that an opportunity for the United States to perhaps step up and somehow participate? I'm not suggesting any specific way, but was that an opportunity that is being missed because the pendulum hasn't come back far enough yet?
It was certainly missed when the United States expressed sympathy on the death of Raisi. There was no need for that. The United States could have pointed out his malign career, could have pointed out that the Iranian people were well rid of a person like that, and expressed the hope that in an upcoming election, some worthy successor might emerge. I don't know whether that hope would have been realized or not, but still, it would have provided the occasion, at least, for giving some hope to the Iranian people that the United States was behind their interest rather than the interest of the government that rules them.
I asked what the impact was of different administrations having different policies. But the one thing that has been consistent for 45 years is we seem to be, use a baseball analogy, swinging and missing. What's missing from the United States policy that could be implemented by any administration that would assist the people of Iran?
Well, that's a very tough question. I think that you were absolutely right when you described the history of the United States. You don't want American fingerprints, you don't want American money going to support the overthrow of a regime, because I think that defeats its purpose. And it ends up backfiring and hurting the very groups that receive that aid. On the other hand, you don't want to be doing things that discourage the people. And I think Judge Mukasey was right in talking about the expressions of condolences. Another opportunity, by the way, came, we talk about Iran being days away from being able to actually produce nuclear weapons. They launched an attack not too long ago of 1,000 missiles into Israel. Just imagine that kind of show of force if they had those weapons and could mount them. I mean, that, I'm glad there was a coalition that, prevented those missiles from striking and killing people. On the other hand, I might have liked a different, stronger approach to Iran at that moment.
Those missiles going toward Israel are an important benchmark here is the Arab world is largely united in the Israel-Gaza situation, and that is not in favor of the United States or Israel. And so how does that impact the attempts to have an impact on policy in Iran? How does the fact that the war is raging, that the Arab world is generally on the exact opposite belief as the West?
Well, I think, again, I want to come back. We need to act on what is in the self-interest of the United States of America. We understand what Hezbollah and Hamas is doing, not only in attacking Israel, but in disrupting lines of trade and our national defense. And so acting on our self-interest in line with what is good for those voices within inside of Iran is not about us meddling. It's about us doing what is intelligent and our self-interest.
Self-interest, it obviously essential. You know, President Trump took great criticism for using the words America first. But the analogy I always use is, as a parent, if the building is on fire and there are 5 children, you will probably locate your own child first. You'll probably go back and try to save the other 4 children, but you will probably try to locate your own child first. Human nature. And the idea that Americans would look out for America first does not mean they won't also look out for our friends and neighbors around the globe. We will go and try to assist them as well. Considering self-interest, though, what is in America's best interest? What is the correct policy toward Iran?
The correct policy toward Iran is to keep unremitting pressure that will allow the Iranian people, that is, to keep unremitting pressure on the regime that will allow the Iranian people to have an easier time when they arise to overthrow it. I think it's important to remember that even when Iranians were demonstrating against harsh economic conditions, they were not demonstrating against the United States, which was imposing sanctions and was responsible in part for those harsh economic conditions. They were demonstrating against the regime. So we don't lose popularity, we don't lose a following by acting consistent with our principles and pressing as hard as we can on the regime.
Let's talk about the Iranian opposition, the NCRI and the MEK. What's the perception? What is your belief that the perception is of the opposition efforts within Iran?
Well, it depends on who you mean by,
In
referring
the
to
general
in the general public. Well, I think, in America, I think probably the NCRI is not well known, and if you mentioned Maryam Rajavi's name, there would be few except elites who would have any idea who you were talking about. There's been a very concerted effort on the part of the Iranian regime to vilify the NCRI and the MEK. And they were assisted back when the MEK was on the terrorist list, and it was easy to do. It's a little less easy today, in part because there are a lot of Americans, many of them who've held influential posts, like the gentleman on this panel, in previous administrations, who I think make it more difficult to do that kind of demonization. But I think anybody who's had contact with the NCRI or the MEK, as I have, going back to the 1990s, when I first became aware, when Ambassador Blackwell was the UN Human Rights Ambassador, and I was on the subcommission on human rights. Anyone who's worked with them a long time knows that they have been promoting the same values, the same principles. Madam Rajavi's 10-point plan is modeled in many ways after the American Bill of Rights, all of the rights that are talked about in there, but also something that is very much in our self-interest, going back to your previous question, which is keeping Iran nuclear free. That is America's #1 interest. Iran must not be allowed to get nuclear weapons.
the American public does have some limited knowledge of the alternatives there, but within the borders of Iran, how is the NCRI perceived?
I think they're perceived as being amplifications of the dissent within the borders. Look, there is a concerted effort to not only demonize but to minimize the impact of the MEK and the resistance. I try to balance two thoughts. I grew up. My dad used to say, "Dogs don't bark at parked cars," and so the fact that the regime is barking means that there is growing support and amplification for freedom, both inside and outside, in terms of the resistance. Yeah, and I think it's important that we understand that you can't. It's a time for choosing, and people understand that you either choose to continue the repressive regime, or you in fact are on the side of freedom and individual liberty and human dignity. And I think as on the outside, as we give amplification to the human dignity and the effort, we counter that false narrative, that false description that the regime and its allies try to promote outside of Iran in the larger body politic.
If we look at troubled areas around the globe, and you can pick Libya, you can pick Sudan, you can pick anywhere you want that has difficulty, there are alternative government groups that pop up and want to claim power. Why should we take the NCRI as a serious alternative? What is different about them than anyone else that wants to lay claim to Iran?
I think what's different about them is that for years, decades, they have had a 10-point plan, as you pointed out before, that includes principles with which Americans are comfortable and that are easy to explain and should be popular to people who want to run their own lives. They are not about factionalism. They are about unity, and they should remain about unity. I think it's an important thing, particularly in a country like Iran, where there are many different groups and nationalities, some of which may be vying for power for their own sake. But if you seek regime change using principles that apply to everyone, I think that creates an enormous opportunity.
How realistic is regime change in the short term?
Well, I'm optimistic. I mean, time will tell, but I think the next few years are going to be critical. I think the death of Raisi opened up a possibility. I think the fact that you are seeing, even in this autocratic state, such low turnout for voting suggests that the stranglehold is not quite as strong as the regime hoped. And I think the economic difficulties. Look, Iran is helping fund the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, all of these terrorist groups abroad. That's less money they have to be able to take care of the needs of the Iranian people. And at the end of the day, again, the mothers, the wives, the husbands who want to put food on the table, want to lead decent lives, this affects them. And at a certain point, they say enough is enough, and they take to the streets. And while the regime has been effective in quashing some of this dissent, it keeps sparking again and again. And I think that, you know, it isn't as if the Iranian people have given up. I think we're seeing more and more protests. They have grown over the last 10 years, and I expect them to continue to grow. And at some point, I think they will be successful.
Let me just tack on to that. We're here in Paris and the Olympic Games will be here in a few weeks. Let me characterize Mrs. Rajavi and the broad coalition of opposition. They have proven themselves to be not sprinters, but long-distance runners.
Right.
They, in fact, have been in this battle. They have survived. They have had impact. They've had ups and downs, but they, in fact, have survived. And one of the things that I know, coming from the States in California where wine is made, this old winemaker saying, if there's no struggle on the vine, there's no character in the fruit. And the opposition has the character because they've stayed. They've stayed through the ups and the downs. And that's why they're going to win.
Ambassador, you mentioned before that the regime doesn't miss an opportunity to criticize the MEK, to take them to task, to try to belittle them. Explain why that's important. What does that mean?
Well, they just have to try to control the narrative. They have to paint this picture that there's no organized opposition, that everybody is fat and happy. And they try to tell the broader public, the broader global community, don't believe your lying eyes. And so control of the narrative and control of who pushes back. I've said a number of times at the Human Rights Commission, folks on the jury should actually be in the dock, many of them. And as a consequence of that, they control the narrative. They say these folks don't know what they're talking about, and they never get a real strong criticism from the United Nations or the Human Rights Commission. They think that they can continue their reign. And so that's why it's so important to give amplification to the dissenting voices, to actually have the courage to use, through our bilateral relationships, build a voice within the United Nations system that condemns the terrorist behavior. Let's not lose sight that 120 political prisoners have been executed in Iran. That is not only crimes against humanity, because there is an order to execute based on a party affiliation or whatever, is in fact, I think, a reason for the international community to start to look for evidence that there's genocide.
The United Nations Special Rapporteur just put out a report about a month ago that pointed out that in 1988, that wasn't simply crimes against humanity, that was indeed genocide. We've seen oppression, we've seen violence against their own people continue for 40 years since then, almost 40 years since then. What does that tell the rest of the world? And is the rest of the world noticing? That's the alarming part, as we're seeing what's now labeled by the United Nations as genocide, but it doesn't seem to be getting any attention.
Yeah, the silence of the rest of the world over this period has been deafening and discouraging. On the other hand, there are trends within Iran that have been ongoing for the entire period. More and more expressions of dissidence, more and more expressions of discontent with not only lack of political freedom, but lack of economic opportunity. There has been lower and lower participation in civic activity like elections, combined with greater and greater friction among the ruling group. Those trends can't continue indefinitely. And there was a famous economist, I believe named Herb Stein, who said something that can't continue indefinitely won't. And we ought to be prepared for the moment when the rising unpopularity, the rising expressions of dissidents, and the greater friction, as coupled with the lower participation in elections, eventually result in collapse. We ought to be alert to the opportunity that will come when that happens, and be prepared with a program, not only 10 principles, but perhaps a detailed constitution that people can look at and see that there's a plan for a better day.
The Supreme Leader has a vision, but he cannot act alone. There are people that carry out his wishes. There are people that incur violence on others, that take away human rights from others. When that day comes, when the collapse happens, what should happen to those who have participated willingly and forcefully with this current regime?
Well, I think they should be put on trial, and they should be dealt with in the ways that we've seen other people who have committed atrocities dealt with. I mean, we had the Nuremberg trials, we had after the war in the Balkans, we had people prosecuted who engaged in war crimes. And when you talk about the killings and the executions, you know, a lot of autocratic regimes engage in extrajudicial killings. They do so privately. They try to hide it from the world. Iran doesn't do it that way. They hang people from cranes in the middle of stadiums or on the public streets. And they do that for a very specific reason. They want to terrorize the population. They are sending a message. If you engage in dissent, if you attempt to bring democracy to Iran, you could end up at the end of a rope on a crane. And I think it's very important that we speak out about this and that we make this known, because I don't think it's widely known in the United States or in much of the free world. We treat Iran like it's just another government. It is not just another government.
We hear the word oppression, we use the word oppression, and yet I'm not sure in the United States that we fully grasp the concept of oppression. Each of you, by the nature of your job and experience, has seen oppression in different parts of the globe. But I've told the story before, and I'll share it with you, and then I'm going to ask each one of you to answer with examples of oppression. But on Inauguration Eve, on January 19th, 2017, the night before Donald Trump was sworn in, I was walking around Washington, D.C. with my son, going to different events in the city. And there was a young woman not too far from the National Press Club standing in the middle of the street, holding a sign with an obscenity and then Trump's name. And so I approached her and said, I do a radio program, I would like to talk to you. And first, she didn't want to talk to me. She assumed I was part of the Trump people. And I said, it's not about me. I just want to talk to you about your opinion and why you have this need to express this publicly. And she said to me, it's about the oppression here in the United States. She's standing in the middle of the road in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., the night before Donald Trump is to be sworn in, holding a sign insulting Donald Trump. No one cares. She is not being stopped from doing this, but she was convinced she was being oppressed. And I asked her, have you ever traveled outside of the United States? And she said, no, but oppression is oppression no matter where you are. And so I would ask each of you to tell me a story of what you have seen or heard in the way of oppression in Iran or elsewhere around the globe that can better define what oppression really means. General.
I've seen and heard about oppression in Iran in the form of women simply wanting to live their lives, their private lives, normally, being dragged through the street, humiliated, had violence committed upon them, simply for wanting to lead what we regard as a normal private life. That, to me, is the very definition of oppression, the inability to have a private life. That is, to me, the ultimate oppression. Forget about expressing public views. The notion that you can't live your own private existence as you wish is the very definition of oppression. And I think people in the United States who exquisitely proclaim that they are being oppressed because they hear expressions or opinions that offend them and regard that as oppression ought to be shaken by the lapels and brought to their senses.
Ms. Chavez.
Well, certainly the whole idea behind the Iranian regime, as I've said multiple times, that we're not just controlling people's public behavior, we're controlling people's private behavior. That is clearly an example of repression. And when you have, as you have in Iran, people who are in prison, women, for example, who are imprisoned, they don't have a fair trial, they are kept in the most appalling conditions, and many of them are raped as a punishment. This is a method of torture of female prisoners in Iran. The idea that you could end up in that situation for something as simple as your scarf falling off in public, or your, participating, having music played, the wrong kind of music played in your home, that those kinds of things could land you in prison. That is a very different thing than what we see in the rest of the world. I mean, we have very, very broad rights in the United States of freedom of expression. You can, in fact, say very nasty things about the president, no matter who he is, and you can do it in pretty obscene terms if you choose to do so. But you're not rounded up, you're not thrown in jail. And if you do end up breaking a law and being accused of a crime, you get a trial, you get tried by a jury of your peers, and you get put into a prison where you don't have to worry about being raped as a method of torture against you because of your political views.
Ambassador.
Death camps, fatwas, examples of human oppression. We've seen all across the globe, and we've seen it within our 250 years of existence as the United States of America. The irrepressibility of the human spirit to be free. These guys are getting ready to find out that keeping people enslaved, denying them their freedom, is like playing whack-a-mole. We're going to keep popping up all over the globe and within Iran. And that is what I witness every day. That these folks are long-distance runners. They're not going away because the human spirit is not repressible. It will, in fact, break through. And that is what I think gives folks so much hope. Those who would do evil, as we're told in my holy book, love the darkness. And our job is to light candles and punch holes in the darkness of our time. And that is what is happening both inside Iran and outside. And freedom will win.
For this discussion, we've got an audience in Iran. We've also got an audience in the West. And it's always a fine line understanding cultural differences versus regimes that are trying to enforce their personal beliefs on every human being. How can a Westerner in Europe, in the United States, grasp the concept of cultural difference versus punishing people simply for stepping outside a norm or for a veil falling off?
I think we have to recognize and promote the distinction between what you call cultural differences that express themselves in different observances and other strictures of that kind, as compared to imposing conditions of existence on other people. When you cannot say that universal imposition of Sharia law is a cultural difference. It's more than a cultural difference, it's a political difference. And we need to recognize that, and simply because somebody uses, for example, a religion as a basis for saying, well, this is a cultural difference, we have to be stalwart enough about freedom to push back and say, no, that's not just a cultural difference. That is a difference that affects other people, and that is something we are not going to tolerate, not among ourselves, and we're not going to cooperate in making you force your own people to tolerate it.
Let's shift gears just a little bit. Before the Islamic regime took over, 1979, Iran had some of the finest universities some of the finest hospitals, some of the finest human services, not only in the Middle East, but on planet Earth. If there is regime change now, how quickly can these people recapture what was once a great country?
Well, I think they actually will recapture it. Part of the reason is I think it's a very well-educated population. You don't have massive illiteracy, for example. And so I think that is, presents an opportunity after regime change. I think there is a thirst for knowledge. The Iranian people, the whole culture of Iran, the Persian culture that goes back centuries, was one of the great cultures in the world, not just in the region. This was a first-class world culture. And the people who live there now still embody that heritage. And so I think you will see a renaissance if there is regime change. And I would expect that Iran would once again become one of the great flowers of the Middle East. I think it would be, there would be a real opportunity for it to blossom.
There are a lot of folks within the diaspora that would come back and bring their talents and accelerate not only recovery, but the regeneration of the genius of the Iranian people. And so I have no fear that the recovery and the renaissance will be quick. But the General said something that was very, very important, and that we've been for decades now witnessing a dynamic tension between respect for moral absolutes and the marching of relativism. And I would just alert all who have signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that it, in fact, has as one of its anchors the fact that human rights is a moral absolute. It cannot be stamped on. And so I think there are a lot of hypocrites who are remaining silent about the brutality. We're not asking them to suit up and arm up and go and fight on the front, but we are asking that they shine a truthful light on the repression that is going on inside. And that's the only way you do it, and the motivating force for doing that is to say that those Iranian people are protected by are covered by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which say that they have a fundamental right to be free.
Let's expand on that, because with your background at the United Nations Human Rights Commission, you have maybe a better view than most on the UN itself. Is the UN falling down on the job recognizing the human rights violations in Iran?
Yes, and it goes back to something I said earlier, that at the Human Rights Commission, many on the jury should be in the dock. And they have a protection system, a mutual protection system of wrongdoers. And that's why the United States has to use every resource it has to shine a light on that, to call out that sort of hypocrisy. And yes, there's an international silence that is deafening, as we've said. We need to make sure that we turn up, we amplify, the moral right of folks to be self-governing and to be free. And the one way that they're free is to be able to participate, not excluded because you're a woman, not excluded because of your religious belief. That is what we have an obligation to be an amplifying voice of within that body politic, not to turn a coward's ear or a blind eye to the atrocities, and not to do anything that empowers a regime that attacks American interests and human rights across the globe.
I was speaking a couple of years ago at an event in Turkey, and at the conclusion of my comments, they opened it up to the audience for question and answer. And the first questioner got up and was upset at some policy that the United States had toward the Middle East, and asked, why did the United States feel the need to be involved in everything? Why couldn't they just butt out and leave the region alone? And I answered and I said, first of all, I'm not there as an official representative of the United States, but sometimes there are interests that the whole globe is interested in. But the second person that asked a question got up and said, why isn't the United States involved in, and he had some issue that he was concerned about. And I said to the audience, that is the problem right there, is sometimes you like the West's participation, sometimes you do not. Why is it important that the United States play a role? And this is not only for the people of Iran, but for people in the United States who are not always well informed on international affairs. There's so much going on around the globe that mom and dad who are taking their children to baseball or to ballet may not know what's going on in certain corners of the globe. So why is it important that the United States be active and vigilant and assist those people who would see regime change in Iran?
Well, there's a slogan that kicks around, often around election time in the United States, that we can't be a policeman for the world. That's an interesting metaphor, but somebody is going to be the policeman for the world if we're not. And there are many countries out there that aspire to be the policeman for a part of the world. China aspires to it, Russia aspires to it, Iran, in its current regime, aspires to it, the North Koreans aspire to it. If you want a world where the policeman is the Chinese, the Iranian regime, the Russians, or the North Koreans, the surest way to make sure that happens is to say that the United States can't be the policeman for the world. What we have done is to maintain, or to help maintain, through leadership and with the participation of others, a system in which every country could fulfill its potential, where there is freedom of navigation, where there are regular rules of public order. That system doesn't exist on its own. And if we want, as one writer put it, we want the jungle to grow back, then all we have to do is retreat from exercising that responsibility. And the jungle will grow back, and it will not be a happy place.
Let's finish up with the same question for all three of you, and we'll start with you, Ms. Chavez, and that is, how optimistic are you? As we look forward, we've had 45 years. The regime is still in power. We'll see a new president coming soon. How optimistic are you that regime change is imminent?
Well, I suppose it depends on how you define the term imminent. I think we will see change in the very near future. And I don't think we should be discouraged by the length of this particular regime. Those of us who were around during the Reagan era remember that people said, oh, it's just fantasy to think that the Soviet empire, that Ronald Reagan could have any impact on the Soviet empire and its dissolution. But in fact, he did. And we saw the collapse of that empire. Now, unfortunately, the collapse did not mean a free and democratic Russia, but it did allow for the spread of democracy in some of the countries that had been both incorporated in the Soviet Union, but also that had been under the thumb, like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, Slovakia, other countries. So I am hopeful. But it is going to depend on the Iranian people, and it is going to depend on their finally having had enough of this regime. They are still more numerous. The Revolutionary Guard is very large, and the various secret police in Iran are large. But if there were a mass uprising, it would be very, very difficult to control.
Ambassador, how optimistic are you, and do you have any advice for the people of Iran?
I'm very optimistic because history is a process, not a snapshot. If you get locked into believing it is a permanent snapshot, you don't change it. But we've all been invested with human agency, and so getting off of the sidelines, onto the front lines, understanding that sometimes change doesn't come as fast as you want, but it comes if you keep pressure and pressing forward. We learned this in our own 250-year history. I believe that the Iranian resistance will learn it in short order. Stay the course, keep the process, don't retreat to the sidelines.
General, just a slight twist on the question. Again, how optimistic are you for regime change? But what advice would you have to the U.S. administration, whether that's a Biden administration or a Trump administration? What advice to them?
Number one, I am, for the reasons that the ambassador pointed out eloquently and correctly, I'm optimistic. The advice to the Americans is don't do anything that is inconsistent with bringing that about, including strengthening the hand of the current regime in the belief that it can be talked out of being the current regime.
Are there moderates? Final question. Are there moderates if the existing regime does not change? Is there any such thing as a moderate voice?
Listening to the resistance and the freedom fighters inside of Iran, I don't think there's a dime's bit of difference between the folks who are in control right now.
And I want to be very careful how I ask this, but do you believe the current administration understands the complexities of Iran and the relationship with the West?
I think there is a certain amount of naivete in the current administration, but at least we have seen fighting back against some of the surrogates. We've taken on the Houthis, and again, that's in our self-interest. They are messing with our supply chain, and this is affecting Americans in their pocketbooks.
General, final word, how important is this to American citizens?
It's vital to American citizens because this is a vital area of the world. It is something that threatens our own security if the regime continues to build a crescent, as it aspires to, throughout the Middle East. It's very important to our security. And at the same time, a change over there would bring about an enormous benefit to us in freeing up our resources and in promoting not only the prosperity of that part of the world, but our own as well.
From Western Europe, I'm Tim Constantine. I want to thank our panel, Mike Mukasey, Linda Chavez, and Ken Blackwell. Thank you very much for joining us. All the best.